Hi class, and welcome to week 13, in which we discuss assessment for culturally and linguistically diverse students. You might hear these students called CLD students. That stands for culturally and linguistically diverse. So why do we need to talk about this? Well, most of you already realize if you've been in the classroom that today there's more diversity in schools than ever. By 2050, it is projected that white students will comprise between 25 and 40% of the total student population. So students of color will likely be 60 to 75% of your class. Diversification is happening in all areas. It's a myth that it's only happening in urban areas. Uh, Students are becoming more diverse in rural and suburban areas as well. So it's really important to understand how to reach and teach all students, students from different backgrounds, students of different races, ethnicities, students who speak different languages. So we talk about culturally and linguistically diverse students, CLD. We define that as students whose language or culture differs from that of the dominant culture. It could be because of language differences. So CLD students include all English language learners, English as a second language, and any student that doesn't have English as their primary language. It could be because of a factor other than language, such as high poverty. It includes children of unauthorized parents. It includes children of religious minority groups whose religion brings about a different set of beliefs from the dominant culture. So, for example, some of the Orthodox Jewish children that live in Brooklyn. These students usually bring with them a belief system grounded in their native culture, which may be misinterpreted by you, the teacher, if you don't understand the culture. We talk about a process of acculturation, and this is the process of assimilation into a different culture. And in the United States, we find this is particularly a pattern that repeats itself over, excuse me, the generations. It was happening in Ellis Island 100 years ago. It happens today. Researchers talk about four phases of acculturation. First, there's when the student enters the new culture, and there's a phase of euphoria. The student is excited, demonstrates curiosity, is enthusiastic. That may give way after a while as the student realizes all the learning that has to occur. And so there might be a period of culture shock in which the novelty drops away and it gives way to reality. The student may express negative emotions about acculturation. A third phase is anomie, which the student begins to sort out his or her role in the new culture. But it's either here or there. The student doesn't quite feel connected anymore to the old culture and doesn't feel like he or she is a part of the new culture. She may feel like they're in a no man's land. And then finally, hopefully, not all students move into this, but there is adoption or adaptation at least, in which the student fully adopts the new culture or at least adapts to the new culture. The length of stages vary in the individuals. Some people may go through these stages rapidly, some not so rapidly, some may get stuck in a stage. You can actually assess the acculturation process in your students. There have been formal assessments developed, one of which is the Acculturation Quick Screen. It assesses a number of factors, including the number of years that student has been in the district, the number of years in ESL, the home and school language proficiency, etc. I've given you the link there if you would like to actually look at that. It's not a bad survey, and it really helps you understand which of those stages the student might be in. Informal assessments is what most teachers use. Home visits don't occur as much as they used to, but informal in-class observations and creative activities where you ask the student to do certain things and then assess um, the ability of the student to do that. For example, an oral report. CLD student assessment. These are some characteristics influencing assessment, language and literacy skills of the student. This is typically identified by ELS specialists or through mandated English proficiency tests. Um, Lack of support or assessment accommodations while the student is learning English may impair the learning process. So what this means is, obviously, think about yourself going into another country where another language is spoken. If no one were to make assessment accommodations for you and you were expected to be assessed in your native in the new language, you'd probably do fairly poorly, even about things that you knew about. Educational background, prior school experiences, especially for students from outside the U.S., this is important to understand because not all educational systems are the same. It's important to know socioeconomic status, and that's defined as the income, the level of family education, and the job status. And finally, cultural factors. That is the student's degree of familiarity with mainstream culture, and that has an impact on student success. There are some cultural differences, and they have implications for assessment. So, for example, cooperative versus competitive learning. Some cultures teach children to be independent, like in the US. It's a sort of more of a competitive environment, where others encourage sharing and cooperation. So in many cases, for example, Native American cultures believe that the group learns together, and so they struggle to help each other. For cultures that emphasize independence, students may not know how to work with others. And for cultures that emphasize collaboration, they may not know how to work independently, and they may need to develop those skills. Active versus passive learning. Some cultures emphasize the student must be a passive learner, receiving information from the teacher, and this may be misinterpreted by you, the teacher, as laziness. So you need to help that student become an active learner, to help them understand this is what is expected of them, to raise their hand, to participate in class discussions. Don't just misinterpret it as laziness. There's a difference in cultures in the way they view motivation. Some cultures teach that certain subjects and roles are gender specific. So, for example, they might teach that science is an occupation only for men, and this might lead to more or less motivation in a subject. Students need to be specifically told that all subjects are for both genders. Locus of control has to do with whether we think that most things are in our control or out of our control. If we think that most things are out of our control, we exhibit what's called an external locus of control. So think about, for example, playing the lottery. I just couldn't win. Um, that's something that's truly out of your control. But when students transfer that thinking into the classroom, they might say, I can never get an A because the teacher hates me. That would be an external locus of control. Some cultures believe that most things are out of their control, and we want to help these students develop an internal locus of control by having them set achievable goals and then working towards them. There have been reams of research on goal setting and helping students achieve those, and that could be very good at teaching them that most things are under their control. Other cultural differences that we see. Um, Some cultures emphasize different teaching styles. So some might emphasize lecture only. And so the student might be used to that and respond only to that. You have to try different styles and see what works with your group. Some, um, some might be used to cooperative learning only and teaching each other. So you have to try different things. There's also a difference in the way some cultures see time. Some cultures view time as much more unstructured. They might not have strict deadlines the way we do. So if you're working in a situation where you have students who are used to this kind of culture, You may need to help these students understand the nature of deadlines and work progress. Sometimes CLD students experience classroom assessment difficulties. They have problems with tests and other types of assessment. One thing is they might have difficulty just understanding the test language. So you might want to clearly word assessment items at the intended grade level. This is just good practice anyway, as we know from our quiz project. Clear directions, definitions, and glossary are available, and that the sentence complexity is not overly difficult. So you could give, for example, in addition to making everything clear, you could give CLD students a dictionary or a glossary to help them look up words they don't understand. Sometimes they have difficulty expressing what is known just because they're not proficient in the language. And so you can encourage other types of assessment. So that will come over time, by the way, as they build language skills. They may show lack of content and cultural knowledge in test items. So, for example, they may not know what a hero sandwich is. They may not know what the expression, uh, early to bed, early to rise means. So they lack all of these cultural frameworks. And so you need to use very neutral test items they would be able to understand. They might even be unfamiliar with test formats. They might never ever seen a multiple choice format. And so making sure that they understand what to do, and maybe even having them repeat the directions to you is helpful. They may experience emotional stress, so it's best, especially at the beginning, to avoid time tests if possible. So you might accommodate them by giving them double time or even removing the time to element. Maybe use some ungraded assessments when they first come into your classroom, just so they can learn how to do the test. Bias and sensitivity have to do with teachers being human beings, and we all exhibit some type of bias, even if we don't think we do. So you need to be a little sensitive about this. And this week has an assignment in which you're asked to correct some items that may have bias. Um, so think about as you're going through that, the test items you might have seen in the past or you might have even used. So the question to ask yourself about bias and sensitivity are, is the content of the assessment linked to known as opposed to unknown student experiences outside the classroom? So, for example, if you have a test item about skiing, and a student doesn't understand the mechanics of skiing or understand what it is, then that puts that student at a disadvantage. So these should be common experiences that all students will probably have had experience with. You need to ask, does the assessment match the developmental levels of the student? That's just good practice in general. Do the language demands match the levels and proficiencies of the students? So keeping things simple, using simpler words. You might have to rewrite some test items for, uh, for CLD students. And finally, is the content racially and culturally sensitive? I'm always amazed, at least once a year, I hear about a teacher who gets him or herself in trouble with really just a stupid, dumb test item that talks about slavery or talks about Hispanic children picking crops. I mean, it's just ridiculous. And so you wonder about the judgment of these teachers, but it's easier to slip up on some of these things than you might realize. And it's very important for the children to go over these items and make sure they're very sensitive and they're very neutral. Assessment strategies. You need to make sure that students understand the learning target. This is good practice in general. You write the learning target or you communicate it to them verbally using children-friendly words. You don't use words like objective unless they're older. And so you just put it in their language. You can You can conduct observations using the power of formal and informal observations to understand and document the characteristics and needs of these students. You can assess nonverbal behavior and vocal cues, so you can watch their body language. You can watch their gestures, listen to their pauses. Are they stumbling through their words? What level of proficiency do they seem to be demonstrating? All of this while keeping in mind that these things can mean different things in different cultures. So what you have to ask yourself is the student whose native language is Spanish, but who's learning to speak English pausing because they don't know the words or because they have such respect for authority that they're a little embarrassed or shy to come forward to you as the authority? And finally, you can use informal questioning. So tailor the question to the language level and use fair processes to call on many different students. So we've talked about this a little bit in class. Calling randomly on students helps. Using simple and clear direct words helps. Native language support for beginners may be necessary. So in a lot of classrooms, there'll be a translator at the very beginning, someone, perhaps another student who speaks the language. This should not be used long term as the student begins to master English. Assessment strategies during instruction. CLD students often use strategies called code switching. And you might hear them start a sentence in Spanish and continue it in English and then end it in Spanish. This is actually a good thing. It means they're starting to understand the syntax of the language and be able to substitute words. Plan for additional support for homework. So you might shorten their assignments or provide alternative assessments. Provide language and other modifications for in-class assignments. Small group work helps. So they might not be willing to speak up in a full classroom discussion, but students might be willing, CLD students might be willing to speak up in a small group of 3 or 4 other students. There are some assessment strategies for testing. So if you're testing these students, you could provide language and other modifications for in-class assignments, such as pre-tests, worksheets, projects, and tests. Small group work helps. Of course, it helps to train all students, but especially CLD students, on format. So how do you do a multiple choice item? And test-taking strategies. Some people say, well, they should be tested in their own language, but actually the research suggests no. They should be given the test in their language of instruction. So if they've been taught in English, they should be assessed in English, but with accommodations. So, for example, giving them extended time, simplifying the test, giving them dictionaries. All of these would be accommodations, or graphic or graphs or diagrams. All of these would be accommodations to assist CLD learners. Use good practices. That's just for everybody, but especially CLD. You don't want confusing items. Write culturally sensitive and non-biased items. We've talked about that a little bit. Extra time. Simplify language. Provide examples or word banks on constructed test items. So, for example, if you have a bunch of fill in the blanks for your class, you might construct a word bank, put it in a little box with all the words that could go in the blanks, and give that one to the CLD student. Provide visual and graphic support, dictionaries, glossaries, and use alternative assessments such as portfolios and performance-based tasks. We know, for example, that especially portfolios work well to document students' progress in learning the language and in understanding content. So how do you grade CLD students? Well, you need to focus on the progress that they make towards meeting the standards or the goals. Don't overly emphasize effort. So Some teachers will just say, look, they put in a lot of effort. They don't have the language yet. I'm going to give them an A. No, you have to really still document how well they're meeting the standard or the goal, or otherwise you're selling them short. So you're going to measure knowledge and skills and not language. It's helpful to do multiple measures. So you might have homework and a quiz and a project. Some teachers separate grades for assessments provided in the student's native language from grades for assessments in English. So for example, if you have a quiz and it's given in the native language of the student and they do quite well on it, an A, and then you have a homework assignment given in, let's say, English, which is not the native language, and they get a C, you might show 2 grades on a report card. Check your school district for policies such as this. So what are some of the big ideas we've learned today? First, the number of CLD students is increasing in our schools. We need to understand the home culture somewhat of these students. We need to understand where they are in acquiring language skills. Accommodations should be made in terms of teaching and assessing these students. We discussed some of these accommodations in terms of providing extra support through dictionaries and glossaries, simplifying the language, modifying the assessment, for example, to provide a word bank, uh, providing instruction through a buddy who speaks the native language, etc. And finally, when we write test items, we need to make sure that these assessment items are culturally sensitive and neutral. And that's related to the assignment you'll be doing this week. Everybody have a great week.